Welcome to New Genesis Novel, where the greatest minds are modernized for today. Hello, I'm Francis Thompson, the author of Masterpiece. That masterpiece, as many of you may know, is the poem The Hound of Heaven, a work born from the absolute depths of my despair and the relentless pursuit of divine grace. But long before I penned those verses, before I wandered the unforgiving streets of London as a destitute outcast, I was a boy surrounded by the quiet comforts of a devout home. I was born in Preston, Lancashire, in the year 1859. My parents, Charles and Mary, were both converts to the Roman Catholic faith, and their devotion permeated every corner of our household. My father was a respected physician, a man of science and profound faith, while my mother possessed a gentle, nurturing spirit. From my earliest days, I was steeped in the rituals and the soaring liturgy of the church, which planted the seeds of mystical imagery deep within my mind. As a child, I was frail, timid, and hopelessly lost in my own imagination. I preferred the silent company of books to the boisterous games of other children. Recognizing my pious nature, my parents sent me to Owens College in Durham when I was 11, with the fervent hope that I would study for the priesthood. I spent 7 years there, surrounded by the solemn cloisters and the rigorous discipline of seminary life. I desperately wanted to fulfill my parents' dream and serve God at the altar, but my masters saw things differently. They noted my chronic absent-mindedness, my nervous disposition, and my sheer inability to adhere to the strict practicalities required of a priest. When I was told I was not suited for holy orders, the rejection struck a devastating blow to my spirit, leaving a void I struggled to fill. Hoping to provide me with a respectable profession, my father subsequently enrolled me at Owens College in Manchester to study medicine. I was to follow in his footsteps, yet no path could have been more ill-suited to my temperament. The sight of blood, the clinical dissection of the human form, the sterile environment of the hospital wards, all repulsed me. Instead of attending medical lectures, I spent my days hiding away in public libraries, devouring poetry, history, and literature, or wandering aimlessly through museums. It was during this period of profound aimlessness and physical frailty that I was first introduced to the substance that would become both my temporary refuge and my lifelong ruin. I had fallen ill, and to ease my suffering, I was given laudanum. Around the same time, my mother had gifted me a copy of Thomas De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium-Eater. The tragic romance of De Quincey's prose, combined with the seductive, numbing relief of the opiate, ensnared me completely. I failed my medical examinations year after year, much to the bitter disappointment of my father. The chasm between us grew until it could no longer be bridged. Ashamed, addicted, and entirely unequipped for the demands of the practical world, I eventually fled to London. I carried nothing but a few volumes of poetry in my pockets, descending rapidly into the brutal poverty of the streets, selling matches and holding horses just to survive, setting the stage for the divine chase that would eventually save my soul. Those early days of comfort and expectation in Lancashire felt like a distant dream when I found myself sleeping along the embankments of the River Thames. Yet, I now realise that every failure, every rejection at Owens College, and every skipped lecture in Manchester was a necessary step on my journey. My inability to become a priest or a doctor ensured that I would eventually become a poet, a broken vessel through which a much greater light could eventually shine. The foundation of faith my parents instilled in me never truly vanished. It merely lay dormant beneath the haze of opium and the grime of the London slums, waiting to be awakened. I speak to you from the far side of a profound and terrible darkness. For my life upon this earth was a tapestry woven largely of sorrow and rejection. If you ask of my greatest struggles, you ask me to map the very cobblestones of Victorian London, where I wandered as a phantom among the living. My first and perhaps most piercing rejection was not born of malice but of my own profound inadequacy in the eyes of my father. He had intended for me the noble profession of medicine, and sent me to Owens College in Manchester to learn the healing of mortal flesh. Yet I was utterly unsuited for the dissecting room and the clinical coldness of the wards. I failed my examinations repeatedly, not out of a lack of intellect, but because my soul was already adrift in a sea of poetry and paralysing melancholia. When I finally confessed my failure and fled to London, I felt the heavy door of familial expectation slam shut behind me, leaving me in exile from my own blood. But London was a cruel mother to a penniless dreamer. I descended into an abyss of destitution that defies the comprehension of those who have never slept beneath the arches of the Thames. I became a creature of the gutter selling matches, holding horses and calling cabs just to earn a copper for a crust of bread. The polite society of letters, the editors and the publishers rejected me, not merely because I was unknown, but because I was unwashed, a ragged scarecrow of a man whose very presence offended the sensibilities of the respectable. Yet the physical starvation was but a shadow of my greatest and most terrible struggle, which was the iron grip of laudanum. I had first tasted the golden poison to soothe an illness, but it quickly became my master, my comforter, and my destroyer. Opium offered me a kingdom of dreams when the waking world offered only frost and starvation, but it demanded my soul in return. It alienated me from reality and plunged me into a spiritual despair so deep that I believed myself entirely forsaken by God and man. I fled from divine love just as I fled from human connection, terrified that the light would expose the wretchedness of my ruined state. I was the very soul I later described fleeing down the nights and down the days, hiding in the mist of tears and running from those strong feet that followed after. Even when I finally summoned the desperate courage to send my soiled and crumpled manuscripts to the magazine Merry England, I faced the agonizing silence of delayed hope, for my letters lay unread for months. When Wilfred Meynell finally sought me out, I was so broken, so accustomed to rejection, that I initially fled from my own salvation. The struggle to accept grace, to allow myself to be pulled from the opium-soaked gutters, and to believe that my broken life could yield any verse of worth was the supreme agony of my existence. I was a man who had to be hunted down by the Hound of Heaven because I was too terrified of my own unworthiness to stop running. Every rejection I faced from my father, from the editors, from the indifferent crowds of London, was ultimately a stripping away of my earthly illusions, forcing me to realise that I had nothing left but the relentless pursuing love of a God who would not let me perish in the dark. I am often asked to speak of that relentless chase, the great pursuit that I captured in what you now call my most famous work, The Hound of Heaven. When I penned those lines, I was a broken man, a destitute soul wandering the unforgiving cobblestones of London, shivering in the damp fog, caught in the terrible grip of laudanum and despair. Yet it was in that profound darkness that I felt the inescapable presence of the divine. The central metaphor of my poem, the hound itself, has startled many. To liken the almighty creator to a hunting dog seems, to some pious minds, almost profane. But you must understand the nature of a bloodhound. It does not hunt out of malice or a desire to destroy its prey. It tracks with a singular, unswerving devotion. God is that hound, and I was the terrified, exhausted hare. The hound represents the tremendous, pursuing grace of Christ, a love that follows with unhurrying chase, an unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy. It is a love that refuses to let the sinner go. I wrote that I fled him down the nights and down the days, down the arches of the years, and down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. These are not mere poetic fancies. The labyrinth represents the complex, twisting intellect, and the endless rationalizations we use to evade God. I sought refuge everywhere but in the arms of my Saviour. I knocked on the doors of human love, hoping to find a sanctuary, but found that human hearts are fragile and easily broken, incapable of bearing the infinite weight of a desperate soul. I turned to the innocence of children, but just as their eyes began to answer mine, the angel snatched them away. I threw myself into the bosom of nature, attempting to draw warmth from the sun and the stars, trying to share the secrets of the wind and the dawn. But nature, for all her breathtaking beauty, is fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. The skies do not weep for our sins, and the earth cannot offer absolution. Nature is a magnificent creation, but it is a poor stepmother to the human spirit. The hidden meaning of my flight is the universal human condition. We are terrified that if we surrender to God, we must give up everything else. We fear that having Him, we shall have naught beside. This is the great illusion of the fallen mind. As the chase nears its end and I am stripped of all my earthly comforts, battered and laid bare by the pursuit, the metaphor shifts from terror to profound tenderness. The looming shadow that I thought was my destruction, the darkness that I feared was the abyss, is revealed to be the shade of His hand, outstretched caressingly. The grand paradox of the poem, and indeed of my own wretched but redeemed life, is that the very things I thought God was cruelly taking from me were merely being gathered up and preserved in him. All which I took from thee I did but take, not for thy harms, but just that thou mightest seek it in my arms. The hound does not catch us to devour us. He catches us to carry us home. Every sorrow, every deprivation, every tear, wept in the gutters of London, was but a necessary stroke of the divine chisel, shaping my soul to finally accept the love that had been chasing me from the very moment of my birth. That is the ultimate secret of the hound. The pursuer is the very peace we are running to find. I speak to you as a man who has known the deepest gutters of London and the highest, most terrifying reaches of divine grace. If you ask me of human nature, I must tell you that we are fundamentally creatures of flight. We are frail, shivering things clothed in dust and prone to the most wretched illusions. I have seen the absolute poverty of the human condition not merely in the starved alleyways where I once sold matches to buy my bitter oblivion, but within the hollow chambers of my own breast. Human nature is a paradox of immense longing and immense terror. We ache for the infinite, yet we flee from it with every ounce of our strength. We seek our comfort in the finite, begging the stars to hide us, begging the fleeting affections of men and women to shelter us, and hiding within the vapours of artificial dreams. Yet the tragedy of our nature is that these earthly sanctuaries are entirely insufficient. They betray us not out of malice, but because they are too small to contain the vastness of what we truly need. We are children, running from the only Father who can heal us, terrified that if we surrender to him, we must give up all our petty broken toys. And this brings me to the absolute centre of my philosophy, the nature of love. Earthly love is but a distorted reflection, a mere whisper of the true reality. Supreme love is not a gentle, passive sentiment. It is a tremendous, relentless pursuer. It is the Hound of Heaven. Love is the unhurrying chase, the unperturbed pace, the deliberate speed that follows us down the nights and down the days. I learned through my own agonizing evasions that divine love will strip us of everything we falsely cling to, not to leave us naked and freezing in the dark, but to force us into its own burning embrace. Love is a jealous hunter. It shatters our fragile joys, only so that we might seek our joy in the eternal. It feels like destruction to the fleeing soul, a terrible, deafening footfall echoing behind us. But it is the only true rescue. It is the love that will not let us go, no matter how deeply we plunge into the mire of our own sin and despair. And what then is death? To the worldly mind, death is the ultimate thief, the great silence that swallows all our striving. But I have stood on the precipice of that silence, coughing my life away in the shadows, and I tell you that death is nothing of the sort. Death is the final, merciful strike of the pursuing lover. It is the shade of his hand, outstretched caressingly. We spend our lives fearing the darkness of the grave, failing to realise that this darkness is merely the shadow of the Almighty, leaning close to gather us in. Death is the shattering of the chrysalis. It is the moment the pursuit ends and the eternal rest begins. When the flesh finally fails, when the lungs can draw no more of this cold, terrestrial air, we do not fall into the abyss. We fall into the waiting arms of the one who has chased us across the years. Therefore, my ultimate philosophy is one of surrender. We are weak, yes, and we will run, but we cannot outrun the love that formed us, and we must not fear the death that finally brings us home. I am Francis, a man who once knew the deepest gutters of London and the darkest corners of his own soul. You may know me as the poet who penned the flight from grace, but before the ink ever touched the parchment, I lived every agonizing step of that desperate evasion. I was a creature of the shadows, a medical student who could not bear the sight of blood, a son who disappointed his father, a vagrant who sought refuge in the cruel embrace of laudanum. I wrapped myself in the golden fog of opium to escape the biting cold of reality, believing that in oblivion I might find some semblance of peace. I fled him, down the nights and down the days. I fled him, down the arches of the years. I sought love in the fleeting affections of the world, in the pity of a streetwalker who shared her meagre bread with me when I was starving along the River Thames. Yet no matter how fast I ran, no matter how deeply I buried myself in the labyrinth of my own wretchedness, I could hear those unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, the deliberate speed and majestic instancy of the Hound of Heaven beating after me. I thought that to surrender to the divine meant the loss of all my earthly joys, not realising that my hands were only empty because I refused to open them to the infinite. I was a broken vessel, shattered by my own vices and frailties. Yet the Maker of all things stooped down into the filth of Charing Cross to gather my fragmented pieces. He stripped me of everything I thought I loved, so that I might finally possess the only love that does not wither. I lived in an age of smoke and iron, of industry and empire. Yet the greatest battles I fought were entirely within the silent, aching chambers of my own heart. And now I look upon you, the children of a new and unimaginable age. You stand in a world I could never have fathomed, surrounded by invisible webs of lightning and glass, bathed in the ceaseless glow of artificial suns. You have conquered the skies and mapped the invisible atoms, yet I see in your eyes the exact same terror that once haunted mine. You are running so fast, drowning yourselves in endless noise, in fleeting validations, in the relentless pursuit of a tomorrow that never arrives, terrified of the silence where the eternal voice speaks. You build fortresses of distraction to keep out the very grace that yearns to heal you. Hear the plea of a man who exhausted every earthly escape. Stop running. Do not fear the footfalls of the divine pursuer, for the shadow that stalks you is merely the outstretched hand of a love so vast it eclipses the universe. You think your modern anxieties, your digital addictions, your profound loneliness are unique, but they are only the newest masks on the ancient human desire to hide from God. Turn around. Face the Hound of Heaven. Surrender your desperate independence and let yourself be caught. For it is only when you are finally stripped of all your frantic illusions, standing utterly defenceless in the terrifying light of his love, that you will discover you have never been abandoned, and that the very things you thought you were losing were only being stored up for you at home.